southwesterly winds, which will also turn heavy and thundery at times. Some showers also likely across parts of the Midlands. Those should be less intense than further west, but some heavy ones are still possible, things turning drier throughout the night. And mostly dry for the northeast of England as well, with fewer showers reaching there. Some mist and fog patches, though, developing there. They could be dense. Clear skies, though, meaning it'll turn chilly overnight in the end. Plenty of showers across Scotland as well, those likely to be heavy around the central belt, but it will be drier towards the north and east. And a few showers likely for parts of Northern Ireland. Here it's going to turn dry, with clear spells for a time before rain arrives during the early hours of Monday. So the showers easing then for many overnight, with some dry weather before rain arrives from the west and the southwest later. And that's how this very mixed weather picture is shaping up into tomorrow morning.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Esther McVeigh.
And I'm Philip Davis.
Whether you're watching or listening on TV, online or on radio, we handpick the latest stories, debates and expert opinions for your weekend. So whether that's politics, news or showbiz, we've got it covered.
Join us every Saturday morning at 10 o'clock on GB News.
We are GB News.
And we'd like to say thank you
to each and every one of you
for helping our great nation
find its voice.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Across England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland.
On TV,
on radio
And online.
We're proud to be the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
On the Mark Steyn Show, we cover the stories a lot of people are scared even to mention. The stuff that really matters with some of the world's biggest thinkers.
Now is his opportunity to kind of take the steering wheel of history.
Break away from the flop at 8 o'clock on GB News with the Mark Steyn Show.
On Mark Dolan Tonight, we have a simple plan, which is to inform, stimulate and entertain in equal measure. It's all about getting your opinions on the national television airwaves. I love my viewer emails, mark@gbnews.uk. So do join me every Friday, Saturday and Sunday for big guests, big opinions and a big presenter. 6'5", don't you know? See you then on GB News.
Good afternoon. It's 6 o'clock. I'm Ray Addison in the GB Newsroom. The government has announced that a pilot scheme to reduce the backlog in asylum claims will be rolled out nationwide by 2023. The Home Office says an 8-week test run reduced the time that asylum seekers waited for a first interview by around 40%. Almost 100,000 migrants are currently waiting for a decision on their asylum claims. Home Secretary Suella Braverman says this will speed up the process. The government could revive the British Bill of Rights in a bid to tackle the number of migrants crossing the English Channel. The legislation would give UK courts supremacy over the European Court of Human Rights and prevent judges in Strasbourg from interfering in government policy. That includes sending migrants to Rwanda for processing. The bill was shelved by former Prime Minister Liz Truss, but Justice Secretary Dominic Raab says its return would end the, quote, abuse of UK law. The government says it has contingency plans in place if nurses go on strike amid a growing threat of industrial action in the NHS. The Royal College of Nursing is expected to announce this week that its members have, for the very first time, voted in favour of a national strike in a dispute over pay. More than 300,000 members have been balloted, the biggest ever in the union's history. However, psychiatric nurse Julia Taylor told us she won't walk out because it would adversely affect patients.
Sadly, the list's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. If I go on strike one day, that's going to affect that. And some of my colleagues are, and some of my colleagues aren't intending to strike. But personally, I just can't do it. It's not in my nature. I didn't join the NHS for money.
The Prime Minister will pledge to make the UK a clean energy superpower when he addresses the COP27 summit tomorrow, urging all countries to move away from fossil fuels. He'll warn that tackling global warming is fundamental to future prosperity and security. Mr. Sunak will also argue that Russia's invasion of Ukraine highlights the need to move to cheaper and cleaner sources of energy. Meanwhile, COP26 President Alok Sharma opened this year's summit by urging world leaders to act before there's a climate catastrophe.
How many more wake-up calls do world leaders actually need? A third of Pakistan underwater, the worst flooding in Nigeria in a decade. This year, the worst drought in 500 years in Europe, in 1,000 years in the US, and the worst on record in China.
Back home, the leader of the Liberal Democrats has branded the Tory party incompetent and morally bankrupt. In a speech to the party conference, Sir Ed Davey blamed the UK's rising cost of living on Russia's war in Ukraine. He also criticised the government's attempts to tackle the issue. He called for a stronger windfall tax on energy giants, higher taxes on banks, and said it was time for a general election.
Put a proper windfall tax on the blood oil profits of the fossil fuel giants. Reverse your tax cuts for the big banks. They are unfair and unnecessary, and use those extra billions to give people real help with energy bills, to protect pensions and benefits from inflation, to safeguard schools, hospitals and councils from cuts, and to help homeowners struggling to pay that Conservative property penalty.
In international news, the Prime Minister of Tanzania says at least 19 people have been killed after a passenger plane crashed into Lake Victoria there. Local media reports say the Precision Air flight hit the water during storms and heavy rain while trying to land at a nearby airport. Emergency workers and bystanders have been helping to pull passengers to safety. 43 people were believed to be on board. 26 have been rescued so far. And the Prime Minister has announced an extra bank holiday to mark the King's coronation next year. The holiday will take place on Monday, the 8th of May, after His Majesty's coronation on the previous Saturday. Rishi Sunak says he looks forward to seeing people come together to celebrate and pay tribute to King Charles III. We're on TV, online and on DAB+ radio. This is GB News, the People's Channel. We'll have more at the top of the next hour.
Let's look then at this evening's weather, and the UK's looking blustery and showery as that rain continues to push in from the west. Let's home in on the detail. Starting off today in the southwest, and there'll be heavy showers through much of the evening, some thundery and blustery as well, clear spells though in between. Heading further east, and they're fairly dry, often clear skies to the end of the day, though a few passing showers possible later on. A blustery and showery evening for much of Wales, those showers feeding back in on the brisk southwesterly winds, which will also turn heavy and thundery at times. Some showers also likely across parts of the Midlands. Those should be less intense than further west, but some heavy ones are still possible, things turning drier throughout the night. And mostly dry for the northeast of England as well, with fewer showers reaching there. Some mist and fog patches, though, developing there. They could be dense. Clear skies, though, meaning it'll turn chilly overnight in the end. Plenty of showers across Scotland as well, those likely to be heavier around the central belt, but it will be drier towards the north and east. And a few showers likely for parts of Northern Ireland. Here it's going to turn dry, with clear spells for a time before rain arrives during the early hours of Monday. So the showers easing then for many overnight, with some dry weather before rain arrives from the west and the southwest later. And that's how this very mixed weather picture is shaping up into tomorrow morning.
I'm Arlene Foster, and today I'm joined in the studio by Paul Embry, as well as Emma Webb. Rishi Sunak has been in power since the 25th of October. We'll be discussing how he has performed in his opening weeks and looking at what the future entails for a Conservative Party under his leadership. As the migrant crisis continues to dominate the headlines, we'll be asking what the PM must do going forward and whether the Home Secretary was right to use the word invasion when describing Channel crossings. After a damning report found misogyny and predatory behaviour is prevalent across forces in England and Wales. Well, it's been somewhat of a baptism of fire for Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, who became Prime Minister without a membership election or indeed a public mandate. Voters roundly rejected Liz Truss and her platform of economic radicalism and seem to be warming to the safe pair of hands that Sunak and the Chancellor Jeremy Hunt are offering. Of course, the Prime Minister is facing down a tough series of challenges this winter as the energy crisis continues to spiral out of control and public sector unions threaten strike action over stagnating wages. So has Rishi Sunak shown he has got what it takes for the job, or is he due to end up like his predecessor, shunted out of the party without so much as a backward glance?
What troubles me is how did he get to Downing Street in the first place? And the truth is that Rishi Sunak is essentially a Prime Minister for the markets. And that is something that troubles me in a democracy. Now, Liz Truss embarked on a kind of economic crusade which I certainly don't agree with, and I think would have been very damaging for the country, this kind of brand of economic libertarianism. But at least at the beginning, you know, there was a bit of a return to ideology, which I think in these days where so many politicians agree with each other was not by itself a bad thing, even though I vehemently disagreed with the ideology itself. But the broader question for me is not so much, you know, whether Rishi Sunak is better than Liz Truss, but whether or not it should be the people who elect and decide who leads their country, or whether the market should have such a say. And they have clearly, in the last few weeks in this country, the markets, exerted huge influence. And I think that raises the question of whether or not it would even be possible nowadays for any sort of government to implement any kind of radical economic policy, because, let's be blunt, most of them are going to be fearful that the markets are going to resist it and the markets are going to be spooked and, oh God, you know, that's something we can't do, we can't spook the markets. Now, the truth is, if a Labour government ever came to power with a radical economic manifesto, be in no doubt that the markets would probably react in a fairly similar way. You might see a run on the pound and capital flight and that kind of thing. And the question then is, what does the Labour government do in those circumstances? Does it say, well, actually, we're not going to have the City of London deciding democracy in our country. We're going to deliver on our programme that we were elected on, or we're going to give in to the markets? That seems to me to be the much broader and more relevant question about what's gone on in our country over recent weeks.
So I was in a taxi last night and the taxi driver said to me, it's very clear that the British people want a centrist government. Back to Paul's point about if you have an ideological bent and you want to enforce something new, you're not going to get away with it anymore. And it got me thinking about how would Margaret Thatcher survive in today's media-driven, market-driven environment, really?
I think you're right, and I think that Paul makes a very good point, which is that essentially Rishi Sunak was kicked out by the markets rather than, you know...
Liz Truss.
Sorry, yes, Liz Truss was. Maybe Rishi... maybe Rishi will be kicked out by the markets, but that seems unlikely. And I think actually the point about the British public being more centrist, I think what we're seeing in the misalignment of our politics is actually that the public tend to lean towards the centre on economic issues and towards the right on social issues. And actually the polls have suggested that Rishi is hasn't managed to overtake Labour's lead, but is at least starting to close that gap. And so I think that it's showing signs that really Rishi does have the ability to steady the ship. He is much more prime ministerial. And I think that the British public and the markets are showing more confidence in him. I think it's a shame that on the economic front, and I don't agree with everything that Paul has said. I think it's a real shame the way that this is being painted broadly in the mainstream media, that this huge hole in our budget has been somehow created by Liz Truss's very, very brief stint as Prime Minister, rather than as a result of things like the irresponsible furlough policy that actually, to some degree, Rishi Sunak played a role in that. So I think that our analysis of Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak and the overall situation has been somewhat skewed by the dominating narrative in the mainstream media.
Yeah, and we've seen Starmer and Sunak go against each other in Prime Minister's questions now. Paul, how did you think that worked out compared to Liz Truss and Starmer? It was a much better performance, wasn't it?
Sunak is a more competent performer. There's absolutely no doubt about that. I think he comes across fairly well at the dispatch box. I think he's fairly decent in front of the media. But I have to say, Arlene, I don't think, when it comes to PMQs, I think it's something that sparks the interest of political obsessives, the Westminster Village and so on and so forth. They see it as almost like the end game, you know, who performed the best this week. Actually, the bloke in the Dog and Duck and the man on the Clow, the man or the woman on the Clapham omnibus really don't give a stuff, I don't think, about this sort of thing. And you know, they see that kind of Yahoo politics style. They see the punch up on the TV because it's broadcast, you know, on the 10 o'clock news or whatever. And I think actually it switches people off. I don't think the public generally are particularly interested in that. I think the public want a debate, particularly now during a cost of living crisis where people are struggling to make ends meet, worried if they can pay their mortgage, worried if they can put the food on the table. They want politicians on both sides engaging in serious analysis and proposing serious policies about how to address that. When it comes to issues like who's better at the dispatch box between Starmer and Sunak, I don't think most of them really give a tinker's cuss about it.
Yeah, no, that's true. So, Emma, what is the future for the Conservative Party? Is it about being in that centrist ground and not aspiring to be Thatcher Mark II?
I think you've touched on it. I think the future of the Conservative Party is looking increasingly unconservative, and I think we've known that for a very long time. There are different forms of conservatism. We've referred to free market liberalism for a very long time as conservatism, but that is not the only option. There is a political philosophy of conservatism that hasn't had any representation in our politics for a long time that I think actually resonates with the majority of the British public. I think things like the discussions that we've seen in the last couple of days with Jeremy Hunt's proposals about taking on pensions as a way of raising money for the coffers, basically. I think that is something that is going to be extremely unpopular, particularly with the Tory base. I think that their chances of doing well, let's say, at the next election, whether or not they'll actually be defeated by the Labour Party, I don't know. But I think that they are in real hot water. And I think one of the reasons why we have seen this increasing confidence in the electorate, on the opinion polls, in Rishi Sunak, is simply because the Conservative Party has quite literally stared into the abyss. The situation was so bad towards the end of those Liz Truss days. And I think that was something to do with a fundamental problem in the party, more than it was to do with Liz Truss herself. I think the fact that the Conservative Party have stared into the abyss, at least temporarily, has sort of put their feet to the fire. But I think that the problems within our politics are so fundamental that it's not just a crisis for the Conservative Party, that actually going forward the next election, I think things will become increasingly unpredictable. And so I think it would be a fool's game to put any wagers on what the Conservative Party will look like in the future, whether it will split into two parties, into multiple parties, whether we'll see a third party, like the Reform Party, for example, rising up in the polls, and they're already at 6%. So I think that it would be very, very difficult to call it, but I think it would be fair to say that at least a large faction of the Conservative Party going forward wouldn't rightly be described as conservative.
Yeah. And Paul, you and I have talked about a lot the issue of will Starmer be the next Prime Minister, and you've always made the point that just because you're ahead in the polls at a particular point in time doesn't mean that you're going to win the next election. But after the Liz Truss period, I mean, the Conservatives were so low in the polls, it was quite obvious that Starmer, if there had been an election then, he would have had an overall majority. I mean, do you think he can stay the course? Because I've been reading today that he's continuing to try and deal with what he would see as Corbynistas in the party. And there are some people saying I'm being deselected for very spurious reasons. Do you think he's trying to get ready for becoming Prime Minister and leading a government?
I would caution the Labour Party about assuming that they are nailed on for government. I mean, in the early 80s, for example, Arlene, Michael Foot was miles ahead of Margaret Thatcher at one point opinion polls and then got annihilated at the 1983 election. Kinnock was constantly in front of Thatcher and then John Major and got beaten in the 1992 election. So what's happening now in the polls, it's not completely irrelevant, actually, but when it comes to the general election in a year or two, it's probably not going to have, I don't think, much influence. What I'm amazed at is how the Tories have just squandered the huge advantage that they had from the big political alignment that was taking place in this country, and that manifested itself in the 2019 general election. That was where they won lots of working class seats, red wall seats, on the basis of promising to get Brexit done, on the promise of levelling up, on the promise of being actually not a government that rolls back the frontiers of the state and passes everything over to the market, but says actually we'll intervene in the economy in a way that's going to improve your lives and is going to improve your communities and bring jobs to you. And then having Liz Truss having embarked on this sort of crazy economic libertarian crusade, as I called it, that political legacy has been squandered. And I likened it recently to someone who had won, £10 million on the lottery or something, and then just frittered it all away, and is now bankrupt. And that's where the Conservative Party are at the moment. But they are survivors, the Conservative Party, and they are an electoral machine. I mean, I tend to agree with Emma, actually. There's something profoundly unconservative about today's Conservative Party. They're liberal in all sorts of ways, economically and socially. But it's a survivor party, and come the next election, they will be fighting to win. And it's not in the bag for Labour, I'm pretty sure about that.
And you will remember when Cameron came in as Prime Minister, it became very socially unconservative, if I can put it that way, and there was the moves in terms of dealing with same-sex marriage and all of those issues, which for a lot of older Conservatives was very difficult at that particular point in time. And if you look at the Conservative Party of Thatcher and the Conservative Party of today, they are totally different, Emma.
It's incredible to see how in such a short period of time on social issues the Conservative Party have actually drifted so far to what you would call the left. And actually that Thatcherism, many small c Conservatives wouldn't really regard as being conservative. So that just shows how far the current Conservative Party has drifted from its politically conservative philosophical roots. So I think, as Paul mentioned, this historic realignment that we saw in the 2019 election has been completely squandered. And it's one of the, I think, looking back, historians will see this as one of the great historic missed opportunities, because really our political history could have taken an entirely different trajectory if this had been managed differently.
If you think of those sort of touchstone Conservative issues traditionally, family, law and order, immigration, drugs policy, I mean, the Conservative Party isn't actually, in any sense, really conservative on any of those issues. And we talked today about woke culture. Well, where has this woke culture come from? Under whose government has it developed? Well, it's been around, for, what is it now, 5-10 years, say, during which time the Conservatives have constantly been in office. So if I were a small c Conservative and a supporter of the Conservative Party, I would be thinking, well, why should I actually vote for the Conservative Party? Because they don't seem to be in any way socially or morally conservative at all. And frankly, you only have to look at Boris Johnson. Now, I'm not going to sit here and moralise about Boris Johnson's personal life. But if you were, one of those types of Conservative voters who I explained, who I described, why would you actually see Boris Johnson as a guiding light in your party, as someone who deserves to have ascended to leadership?
And yet, a huge vote winner, as we've already said, in 2019.
We are GB News, and we'd like to say thank you to each and every one of you for bringing us your conversations, for helping our great nation find its voice. We are here for you on radio, television, and online, across England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland.
It's not the BBC, you actually get your facts right.
We are proud to be GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
My name's Tom Harwood, and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today. I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked. Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
On Mark Dolan Tonight, we have a simple plan, which is to inform, stimulate and entertain in equal measure. It's all about getting your opinions on the national television airwaves. I love my viewer emails, mark@gbnews.uk. So do join me every Friday, Saturday and Sunday for big guests, big opinions and a big presenter. 6'5", don't you know? See you then on GB News.
Join me, Arlene Foster, for The Briefing on GB News. Every Friday at 3 p.m, I'll give you all the latest political news and analysis, and we'll have robust live debate. To make sure that you're caught up on all of the biggest issues of the day, we'll bring on experts in their field. I'll ask the questions that you'd like to ask. We're not afraid to tackle discussions from all perspectives, including yours. Don't forget, The Briefing with me, Arlene Foster, every Friday at 3 p.m. on GB News.
We are GB News, right across the nation. You can get us on television, on radio, on digital. We're absolutely everywhere.
Amazing! You see, amazing!
You remind me of me in the European Parliament. But here's the most important bit. We are not part of the mainstream establishment. We think and speak just like you do. We are the People's Channel.
Magnificent. That's really, really thoughtful.
Come and join us on GB News, the People's News Channel.
On Mark Dolan Tonight, as nurses plan to go on strike, I'm sorry, but no one's getting a pay rise because we spent 2.5 years destroying the economy. Well done, everyone. As the COP27 summit starts in Egypt, is the policy of net zero undemocratic? We'll debate that with politics legend Anne Widdecombe and former Labour MP Simon Danczuk. And my Mark Meets guest is former Deputy PM of New Zealand, Winston Peters, a man who's often clashed with woke tyrant Jacinda Ardern. Plus tomorrow's papers and my all-star panel. See you at 9.
Well, it's been widely reported that overcrowding at the Manston Asylum Processing Centre in Kent has led to outbreaks of disease and violence, where some 4,000 people were being held in a building designated to accommodate 1,600. There has been increasing pressure placed on the Home Secretary to get a hold on Britain's migration crisis as illegal channel crossings hit never-before-seen levels. And this week, Suella Braverman found herself facing criticism after she described the number of crossings as an invasion into the UK. Well, joining us now to discuss the situation is political commentator Reem Ibrahim. So, Reem, was Suella Braverman right to use that phrase?
I think that, it was pretty strong language, and obviously it resulted in a lot of backlash. But I think that it's sort of about using accurate terminology to describe the situation that we're in. When you've got thousands coming over every single year, and it's costing the taxpayer a huge amount of money, I think it's quite okay to use that sort of language. I think that the issue is, though, it's government bureaucracy that is causing this huge backlog, and that are actually resulting in these huge amounts of issues on the border. And what we really need to do is actually, allow those safe legal routes to allow migrants to come over legally. Instead of calling it an invasion, we can actually call it sort of economic migrants coming over. We've got refugees. We cannot just, stick our fingers in our ears and sort of pretend that the issue is other people's problems. So I think that the terminology is less important. What we need to focus on is actually solving the problem.
And Emma, I know you have very strong views on this. And I mean, post-Brexit, It was about controlling our borders, not shutting our borders, but controlling our borders. And that's not happening. And clearly it's not happening.
Not at all. And I think, going back to our previous conversation about the Conservative Party, there's this kind of cringing attitude amongst some of them where even the idea that you would have borders is somehow embarrassing. And I think that, as you were saying about, the use of the terminology invasion, the fact that the French now recognise the fact that they dismantled these vast Albanian criminal networks in 2018, and that was exactly the point at which it seems that they turned their focus on the UK, and that was the point at which the numbers started to go up exponentially. And so when we talk about asylum seekers, we talk about economic migrants, there's this third category of intentional criminal activity, smuggling people across the border to enter into the underground economy here. And actually, we know that these Albanian criminal gangs have taken over, for example, the cocaine market in the UK and are involved in all sorts of criminal activity. So for the Home Secretary to describe the huge numbers of Albanian young men who are coming over the channel, orchestrated by these criminal gangs, as an invasion, I think is appropriate terminology, actually.
So basically, Reem, what you're saying is it's not so much about the terminology, it's actually getting to grips with the problem.
Absolutely. I think we need to actually solve the issue. I think that, we can and ah about whether or not the use of the word invasion was correct. I mean, people sort of talking about the hypocrisy of, the British Empire, etc. I think that this stuff is actually...
it's a distraction, actually.
It is a distraction, it is. And this stuff is completely irrelevant to the situation at hand. I mean, we've got thousands coming over every year. We need to solve the issue and actually talk about whether or not we're going to continue to funnel in billions even of taxpayer money into these hotels that are housing a lot of these migrants, talk about the issues that are really, solving. And actually, I think Emma's quite right about this. The criminal gangs are, really where we need to be targeting this. Having a conversation about the word invasion is just a distraction.
Yeah, I spoke to a Labour Party candidate down in Dover and Deal on Friday, and he was saying that the Labour Party would control our borders and they would deal with the issues in a very effective way. There was a lot of claims that the Labour Party would deal with it differently. But what is the crux of the matter? I mean, what needs to be done to deal with this issue?
We need to have these safe legal routes to migration. I'm actually, maybe this is where Emma and I might disagree, but I'm actually pretty pro-immigration. I think that immigration is good for the economy. We've got more taxpayers that are paying into the system. I mean, studies have actually shown that most migrants pay into the system more than they take out through public services. They pay into the system, they create more jobs, they spend money in British businesses.
If they're in the
system. The issue is at the moment they're being essentially propped up by the taxpayer and they're not allowed to work. I mean, I think this is ridiculous. I think we give them about an average of £5.80 a day to twiddle their thumbs in a hotel room. I mean, this is ridiculous. Let them work, let them pay for themselves whilst their asylum claims are being processed.
Paul, your view on this? Obviously, Brexit was a big issue, and part of it was around being able to control our borders. I mean, what do you think about having legal migration?
Well, I mean, I'm pro-immigration, and I think the vast majority of people in this country are pro-immigration, but most people are not pro-open borders. Actually, most people want strong borders. And by the way, there's nothing ignoble about wanting to have strong borders. I mean, most working-class people I meet, many of whom would call themselves Labour voters, want strong borders. They want the government, the state, to be able to control who comes in and who goes out of the country. And the problem is that for too long, for years now, the whole system has been broken and it's been seen as a free-for-all. And the really disappointing thing about that is, as I've said on this show before, it's made the whole debate toxic again. We'd moved on from the 1970s when the National Front were on the march and immigration was a running sore in our society. And it's almost like we've reverted, not as bad as that, but nonetheless it has become, again, an issue of contention in our society. I mean, I'd be interested, Reem, you talk about safe and legal routes, but the reality is, if you apply that policy, it's essentially just going to send a message to the whole world, look, there's a route here, and it's just going to increase the numbers to a point that's even more unmanageable. That's the reality, isn't it?
I think that the reason why the numbers are increasing so significantly is because of how generous our welfare system is. Essentially, what we've promised the world is if you come over, you end up getting housed, you end up, getting benefits, and you end up being paid. This is money that we, as British workers, have paid into the system. We deserve to be able to take out of it. Instead, what's happening is we're essentially, it's a magnet to migrants to be able to come over and actually take so much out of the system that they've not paid into, which is why I think the solution is just letting them work and actually putting a wall around the welfare system, a sort of metaphysical wall around the welfare system, so that only those that have paid into the system can take out of it. I think that will actually reduce the numbers of migrants coming over significantly.
And the crime gangs, which you mentioned, Emma, they're a real concern, of course, to the police, but of course to us as ordinary citizens as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, it's only been a couple of weeks since there were these news stories about people actually breaking into homes in Kent, people who have experienced horrendous situations of people coming into their house and demanding that they drive them to Manchester or otherwise let them use their phone or their computer and that kind of thing, making them lock their dogs in the bedrooms. And you know, when we talk about the history of British colonialism, we never invaded Albania. So I think that there's a real dishonesty actually in the migration debate, and I think that most, as you were saying, you know, most people are not against migration full stop. We're happy to have a reasonable number coming in every year. The problem is that this is mass migration. Since the doors were basically wide open in the 1990s under Tony Blair, we've seen the numbers go up and up and up to the point where it's completely unsustainable. So I think, you know, most people would like for us to be able to prioritise genuine asylum seekers and not to be swamped with all of these economic migrants. But we cannot take in the whole world.
It's that dishonesty in the debate, I think, that really angers people, because there is a distinction between refugees who are genuinely fleeing war and persecution and other people, and I don't condemn them for it, by the way, who are simply trying to seek a better life on economic grounds by coming here. And I think most people look at it and say, look, yes, we should take refugees in genuine fear of their lives, and yes, we should take a proportion of economic migrants as well. That's a sensible thing to do, but the thing has got to be managed and controlled properly. And when they see thousands of undocumented, mainly young men turning up in, you know, from Albania, which is a relatively safe and peaceful country, and he's not at war, and he's vying to be a member of the EU, actually, and they're turning up undocumented on our shores, people simply say, and they're right, this is not sustainable and something needs to be done. And by not doing anything about it for so many years, we're turning people, I think, against the idea potentially of immigration per se, which would be a really sad thing.
It should be decided by the electorate.
Yeah. Well, Reem, thank you so much for joining us this morning to have that conversation. I think it is important here in the political correction that we have the conversation because, as Paul has said, people are afraid to have the conversation because they're labelled either against all migration or for open borders, and it's important that we make the distinction. I'm glad we've been able to do that today. Thank you, Reem. Well, today marks the beginning of this year's COP27 environmental conference, which is hosted in Egypt. Delegates at last year's conference pledged to stick to their promise of 1.5% temperature change, or Celsius temperature change, and experts believe that countries will today be focusing on how to implement such a goal. While former Prime Minister Boris Johnson made environmental concerns a key policy plan for his government, Sunak has come under fire for initially planning not to attend, although he did U-turn at the last minute and is expected to attend today's event. Paul, do you think it's right for our Prime Minister to be at Sharm el-Sheikh today?
I think it probably is. I think it would have been remiss of him to not have attended when so many of the world's leaders are attending. I think the broader question, really, Arlene, is not just about his attendance, but about, you know, what is it designed to achieve, COP27, and what will it actually achieve? And for me, there's never been any proper serious debate, actually, to any great extent, about the consequences of a rush to net zero. Now, as I've said on the programme before, I'm as green as they come. I want to see a green planet, a greener planet, as much as anybody. But equally, I don't want us to get to a cliff edge situation where, and we're almost seeing it now to a certain degree with the lack of energy self-sufficiency, the lack of energy security that we've experienced as a country in recent times, which is entirely self-inflicted as far as I can see. And we haven't had a proper debate about that. But we don't want to get to a situation where, you know, the lights are going off, where people can't heat their homes, where people's jobs and industries are just potentially disappearing, and there's no proper transition, there's no guarantee that they'll have work in future industries. And I think back to the miners' strike in the mid-1980s, when the pits were just suddenly closed because, you know, wrongly in my view, the Thatcher government decided they were uneconomical. And actually look what it did to those communities. Thousands of men, because it was all men at the time, were thrown on the scrap heap. Pit communities went downhill. They suffered the effects, the social decay that came about as a result of that, the violence, the family breakdown, etc. And I've got a real fear that if we just essentially try to erase these industries, and by the way, when carbon emissions are still being pumped out by countries like China and the USA to their heart's content, seemingly, you have to kind of wonder if really it just boils down to posturing on our part, that we're putting ourselves through all of this when it's not going to have any greater impact in the long run. So a greener planet, yes, but please let's have a serious debate about what net zero means.
And that's what I hope we have at COP27, because I think it was right. I think he should go, because apart from anything else, we're handing over the presidency of COP26 to COP27, Emma. My goodness, COP26 seems an awfully long time ago. Boris Johnson was the Prime Minister. He was driving his environmental agenda through. I mean, what really did COP26 achieve, Emma, given everything that has happened with the war in Ukraine and the energy crisis and our own security of supply issues that we have?
Well, not very much. I think that COP is basically an elitist talking shop to make world leaders feel better about themselves and to placate the environmentalist lobby, I think. And so I think it is right that he went for diplomatic reasons. I think it would have been quite weird, actually, if he hadn't have gone. But what I'm more concerned about, as Paul alluded to there, is the statements that he's been making about this, because I think this pursuit of net zero, not just in the UK but around the world, has shown itself already to be inhumane. This is something that has huge implications for people's lives, and it's not something that has ever really been properly put to the electorate. And what we've seen in the Netherlands is that this pursuit is causing serious problems, including potential food shortages. And so given that we are currently facing serious economic crisis, I think it's frankly irresponsible for the government to continue their pursuit of net zero without having any real discussion about what the consequences of that is. And I think that it's something that fundamentally needs to be put to the people, because, like I say, I think that a lot of the green agenda is irresponsible and inhumane.
I suppose it's a bit like the last discussion we had on migration. It shouldn't be either one or the other. We should be moving in the direction of dealing with climate change, should we not? But in a way that allows us to transition, that doesn't do damage to our own citizens. Is that not the way we should be going?
Yeah, there's a great scene in a very British coup where the Labour Prime Minister, left-wing Labour Prime Minister, is intent on decommissioning nuclear power, essentially, and meets a trade union leader who represents the power workers. And the trade union leader, Reg Smith, says, look, my members just see their jobs and industries disappearing out of the door, and they're not going to be bought off with promises of windmills. The truth is renewables are unreliable. Energy secretaries of state for energy going around to coal-fired power stations and having their picture taken, celebrating the fact that a coal-fired power station is being closed and saying, isn't this great, look how green we are. And then all of a sudden, all it took was one international crisis, and we're thinking, heavens, we may be moving to a 3-day week. There may be energy blackouts in the winter, as we've heard some of the talk. That is a serious issue. It's been self-inflicted, and we've got to have a proper debate about that.
We certainly do.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
Join me, Nana Akua, on Friday, Saturday and Sunday afternoons on GB News.
Expect fiery debate and passionate discussion as me and my panel tackle some of the biggest topics hitting the headlines. It's a place for everyone's opinion. No one gets cancelled, but no one gets an easy ride.
Oh, she's on it today.
Be ready for conversations that are fierce, frank, and of course, fun every Friday, Saturday, and Sunday afternoon from 4 p.m. on GB News.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
The national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
Every Saturday at 2 o'clock, join me, Darren Grimes, for Real Britain. I'm not afraid to give you a platform and say it how it is.
Come on, make the case. Something like this is very, very important to people.
And we're always up for a laugh on this show.
God, honestly, you'd think there were no problems in the world.
Real Britain, every Saturday on GB News.
On the Mark Steyn Show, we cover the stories a lot of people are scared even to mention. The stuff that really matters with some of the world's biggest thinkers.
Now is his opportunity to kind of take the steering wheel of history.
Break away from the flock at 8 o'clock on GB News with the Mark Steyn Show.
We are GB News.
And we'd like to say thank you
To each and every one of you.
for helping our great nation.
Find its voice.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Across England,
Scotland,
Wales and Northern Ireland.
On TV.
on radio, and online.
we're proud to be
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Well, I'm very pleased to say that in the studio now we're joined by Sam Johnson from Just Stop Oil. Sam, thanks so much for coming in this morning. You've no paint with you, I hope.
I don't have it. No.
Well, tell me this, Sam. I noticed on Friday that there was a tweet put out by Just Stop Oil saying that if the government doesn't respond to your demands, that you're going to escalate your campaign. What does that actually mean?
That's correct, yeah. We just have to continue. We have to continue with our campaign until the government halts all new future oil licences. We know that. It's a no-brainer, isn't it? We have to transition. We have to do a just transition to renewables now. Renewables are 9 times cheaper than fossil fuels.
And do you not accept that government are transitioning to renewables? I mean, some people would say they're doing it too fast, actually, for our energy security.
Well, then people... I mean, that's wrong, isn't it? They're actively increasing fossil fuel production when they should be reducing it. They're going ahead with 100 new fossil fuel licences. It's madness. It is. I mean, not to be over melodramatic, but it is like a suicidal death project. We know that. If you listen to anyone from the United Nations, the IPCC report, from the International Energy Agency, they're all saying we need to stop oil now. We need to transition. So why aren't the government doing it?
Emma.
I just think this pursuit of your goals at the expense of sometimes putting people's lives at risk, destroying heritage. I think the whole thing is, firstly, I think it's not attracting people to your cause at all. I think it's irresponsible, and actually, I think it's cult-like, actually, because it's not engaging with the British public. It's anti-democratic. You're making demands and saying that we are going to commit criminal acts if you don't meet our demands. That is bordering on extremism.
It's not. Usually, I think the most extreme thing now would be to do nothing, knowing what we know. Well, all the scientists in the world, are they part of this cult? Are we a cult with all the scientists in the world? Are we a cult with the United Nations? Are we a cult with the International Energy Agency? The cult is the government.
Even Extinction Rebellion have said that your strategy is too extreme.
At the moment, we need civil disruption. That's the only way we can force a change.
There's a difference between civil disruption, says she from Northern Ireland, and criminal damage. The criminal damage element of it.
Eileen, what's more damaging? Paint over a bit of property, or, say, young children this winter waking up cold, going to school hungry,
But why is it an either-or, Sam? Because, I mean, I can't understand why throwing paint over property is going to advance your cause? Because it's actually turning people against you. I mean, that's Emma's point.
Well, actually, I would like to say that property that you threw paint over is a building that I have worked in Tufton Street. The reason why you threw paint over that building is because of this strange conspiracy theory that you seem to have, which includes attacking the building on the basis of the IEA and the ASI, even though the Institute for Economic Affairs and the Adam Smith Institute, which aren't even in that building, the sign that you put up on that building was in front of the Civitas offices, which has absolutely nothing to do with any of the things that you object to. There are all sorts of organisations in there that have nothing to do with fossil fuels. You just brazenly committed criminal damage against a building that has multiple people who represent different views inside.
Yeah.
No, I'm sorry,
the Tufton Street
but
has been...
You have literally
has been
put
discredited.
on the M25, you have literally put people's lives
funds
at
a think
risk.
tank that controls our government, and
It
you
doesn't.
know that.
It's a conspiracy theory. I
That's
mean,
not a conspiracy
is the
theory.
idea that it's a puppeteer that controls the government. You have literally put people's lives at risk on the M25 because you think your agenda is more important than people's lives. I'm sorry, but to the British public, that makes you look like hypocrites.
If you have the Prime Minister, he earns 160 grand a year. The oil industry this year made $4 trillion. So you telling me the government's in control over the oil companies?
The truth is, Sam, is the tactics, I think, just leaving aside the argument...
1 second, sorry.
No, hold on. The tactics are self-defeating. And I mean, I say this as I've been a trade union activist all my adult life. I love a bit of protest. I've been one of those people who have occasionally sat down in a road and stopped the traffic if I'm trying to defend the fire service against cuts, for example. But you take the people with you, you get your messaging right, and you adopt tactics that take people with you. It seems to me all you're doing at the moment is alienating the public who support you, and actually putting pressure on the government inadvertently to take a harder line against you, because people are constantly saying, look, these people are disrupting our lives. What are the government doing about it? What are the police doing about it? So actually what you're doing is self-defeating, isn't it?
Well, that's not correct. Basically, recently a poll came out and it said 2/3 of the British public support non-violent, peaceful demonstrations.
Well, there are lots of different forms of non-violent demonstrations.
That is true. That is true. But that's what they're saying. So they will get on board. And the fact is, the media are failing us. The governments are failing us. And the media are failing. I shouldn't be here. People shouldn't be sitting on the M25. People shouldn't be sitting on whatever road you're talking about. People shouldn't
let's
be doing
be blunt. You would have net zero tomorrow, regardless of.
Oh no, not at all.
Regardless of the consequences.
No.
You would have.
Oh no, I'd have a just transition. With 8 years worth in oil licences, we need to have sort of a space age mentality. The dream about going to the moon, to Neil Armstrong landing on the moon, was 8 years. We've done that. Humans can achieve amazing things. Why don't we try and do this? Why are we allowing vulnerable people, men and women, this year, over winter, to freeze to death in their own homes? We should be windfall taxing the oil companies, and we should be protecting the most vulnerable people in society.
Or perhaps we should have maintained our energy security rather than run down our coal-fired power stations, rather than not properly exploring clean coal technology, rather than not exploring fracking and that kind of thing, rather than not building nuclear power stations when we should have done.
We need
energy.
We cut the green crap,
your
didn't we?
Your renewables.
And that's why we're in this problem.
Your renewables, Sam, and, you know, in principle, why wouldn't we want renewables? Of course we want renewables.
9 times cheaper?
They're unreliable, though. That's the problem. They're unreliable.
They are not. This is a myth.
It's all very well saying let's move to net zero. Let's move to renewables. But if that means that the lights are going to go out, if it means that people can't heat their homes, if it means that entire jobs and industries are going to be destroyed,
there's no reason why.
Then actually you've got to face up to that.
A new oil licence they're going to issue this year or next year won't have any bearing on people suffering this winter, and you know that. We need to make a transition. You know that we have everything we need to do. The only thing we're doing is kicking the can down the road.
We are making a transition.
We're not. We're going in the opposite direction. Paul, you know that. The opposite direction.
Well, when you've got, as we touched on just before you came into the studio, when you've got the spectacle of Secretary of States for Energy over recent years having their pictures taken next to coal-fired power stations which have been decommissioned and celebrating it, and we've seen all it's taken is one international crisis to create a knock-on energy crisis in our country, actually there clearly is a transition going on, and some people are fearful that transition is too quick, not too slow.
No, they shouldn't be. Basically, Antonio Guterres, the Secretary-General of the United Nations, said any further future investment in fossil fuels is moral and economic madness. We're heading to a dead end. We need to change now, and we need to make a just transition. That's not all we're asking for. 8 years, but we have to start immediately. You can't disagree with that, can you?
Well, in principle, my fear is that it would be moral and economic madness to go to a situation where there's a cliff edge, which leaves people, you know, freezing in their homes and not being able to heat their homes, not being able to keep the lights on, seeing elderly people die, seeing jobs and industries disappear, seeing the sort of ravaged communities that will happen from that. And as I said before you came in, we can all be green. I think most people nowadays are green. They follow the green agenda. They want to be more environmentally friendly.
I'll pick you up on that point.
But the
problem
process
is,
needs to be sensible.
The problem is everyone is doing their bit. Individuals are doing a bit. But it's become apparently clear that none of that's going to make any difference as long as the governments in the UK and around the world continue to push forward fossil fuels. It won't make a blind bit of difference. The last word or the last sentence on the IPCC report said we have a brief and rapidly closing window to secure a livable future.
I don't think we're going to have a meeting of minds in the studio, but I do want to thank you for coming in and having that discussion this morning.
Eileen.
That's
Thank you
Sam
very much.
Johnson from Just Stop Oil. A damning report found misogyny and predatory behaviour is prevalent across forces in England. I think back to a number of years ago when someone was joining a police force. It wasn't just the individual themselves that was vetted, it was their whole family that was vetted to make sure that this was an appropriate person to come forward and join the police. Why have things got so badly wrong?
There are several issues here that have collided. There's a kind of short-term issue, which I believe is related to the emergency uplift of police officers following what I would call, about 5 or 6 years of criminal stupidity through austerity, where large amounts of experience were levered out of the police service. When that was discovered to be a mistake, although I don't think we've actually had a formal apology for that, and all the metrics were going in the wrong way in terms of police availability and visibility in communities where they absolutely should be, then there was an emergency uplift. And there was a manifesto commitment by the Conservative government to raise the threshold by 20,000 police officers. Now, actually, that recruitment seems to be going relatively well. I believe the target is about 78% complete now on that manifesto commitment by Boris Johnson to have 20,000 additional police officers recruited by 2023. But I guess that one of the problems of having such an uplift in what was and remains still a buoyant and competitive jobs market is that corners are cut in terms of vetting, and you're getting some of the problems that are manifesting themselves. And the appalling report by the Policing, Fire and Rescue Service Inspectorate on a process which has absolutely resulted in people who should not wear the uniform, who stain the uniform, who put their colleagues actually in danger, being allowed to hide in plain sight. So something is very wrong with what's going on at the moment. But I think it's probably a fallacy to say that these problems are all short term. There's a longer term issue with what sort of people are being recruited for the police service. And you'll expect me to say this, and as a special constable in Devon and Cornwall over 5 years, I would reiterate the fact that the vast majority of people join policing for absolutely the right reasons. And they are people who run towards danger when many of us would run away from it. And you see that actually, in a related issue of the Manchester Arena bombing, where the report has effectively sort of revealed, again, lions led by donkeys, where junior police officers on the scene were let down by systems, processes and leadership that totally failed. So, most of the people join the police for absolutely the right reasons. The police also have a problem now with not just the character of some people who are staining the uniform for others, a minority, but also in retention. So even with that 20,000 uplift, where I'm sure corners were cut, vetting wasn't done properly, visits to homes didn't take place, a lot of stuff took place online, you're seeing police officers now under such extreme and extraordinary pressure from a whole host of different sources, including, I would say, trying to police the environmental activism as well, that they're simply giving up and leaving. So we have as big a problem with keeping good police officers in place across the country as we do in terms of getting out and rooting out those racists and misogynists that have been allowed to stay in post for completely inexplicable reasons. And one further thing to say about, and I've written about this before, not just in the CapEx article I wrote this week, but previously, is a need to get frontline supervision correct. You're not going to solve these problems of corrupt police officers in the C-suite in Scotland Yard and elsewhere. You're going to solve it, and I'm sure Paul, coming from a uniformed organisation, knows the same thing. You're going to solve it when you've got frontline supervisors properly invested in to be able to set the tone, to enforce the rules, and where necessary to call out people who are misbehaving. I mean, some of the stuff that was revealed in the previous reports, for example, into the behaviour of police officers in Charing Cross, was absolutely, it was so far over the line, you can't even see the line for dust.
Yeah.
So there's a major problem. It's a minority issue, but it stains the rest of the service. It's got to be gripped. And frontline supervisors play the sergeants and inspectors. It's the same across the prison service, which has had similar problems of mass recruiting without care. Those are the people that will drive the improvement.
Well, Ian, thank you so much for joining us and for giving us a very quick canter through your article, which is in CapX, if anybody wants to look at Ian's article there on police vetting. Paul, we're very short for time, but in terms of the police force, this is a real problem, isn't it, this issue of vetting?
It is, and I think more broadly, Arlene, it's just one of the issues. I think that means that the public have even more now lost faith in the police.
Yeah.
And truth is, I think there are many, many good police officers out there, but if the police were a commercial organisation, trading standards would have been onto them a long time ago, because they don't do what they're supposed to do. Their clear-up rates are appalling, and they seem more interested in adopting, a progressive posture on political issues than actually tackling crime.
Well,
it's a big problem.
My worry is the impact it has on the morale of those good police officers that are in there trying to do a job, putting on the uniform, going to work, serving their communities, and having to deal with these people in their ranks that frankly shouldn't be there.
Let's look then at this evening's weather, and the UK's looking blustery and showery as that rain continues to push in from the west. Let's home in on the detail. Starting off today in the southwest, and there'll be heavy showers through much of the evening, some thundery and blustery as well, clear spells though in between. Heading further east, and they're fairly dry, often clear skies to the end of the day, though a few passing showers possible later on. A blustery and showery evening for much of Wales, those showers feeding back in on the brisk southwesterly winds, which will also turn heavy and thundery at times. Some showers also likely across parts of the Midlands. Those should be less intense than further west, but some heavy ones are still possible, things turning drier throughout the night. And mostly dry for the northeast of England as well, with fewer showers reaching there. Some mist and fog patches, though, developing there. They could be dense. Clear skies, though, meaning it'll turn chilly overnight in the end. Plenty of showers across Scotland as well, those likely to be heavy around the central belt, but it will be drier towards the north and east. And a few showers likely for parts of Northern Ireland. Here it's going to turn dry, with clear spells for a time before rain arrives during the early hours of Monday. So the showers easing then for many overnight, with some dry weather before rain arrives from the west and the southwest later. And that's how this very mixed